Hello and welcome to the Rubber Duck Dev Show. I'm Chris.
And I'm Kristen.
And I'm David.
Hey, and we've got very special guest David Teren. Is that how
That's
you?
right.
Oh, I got it right
That's
the
right.
first time. I win. I win the internet. Hey, Marco, how you doing? So we're going to talk today about kind of safety nets for your Rails and how to write good code and how to help teach new programmers how to write good code and develop good habits and those kind of things, and to keep them from straying too far afield of the way you want things done and the way the community kind of gels. But before we get into that, week in review. Creston, how was your week?
Taxes.
Ooh.
Yep.
So I run my own business, and normally I just pay myself a salary with, of course, taxes withheld. So normally when it comes, when March 15th is the corporate tax due dates and April 15th is the personal tax due dates, normally when it comes around, I've already kind of essentially paid all of my taxes through withholding. So I don't really have to pay that much more, except for this year because Congress, in all of their um, changes, have started classifying software development as a capitalizable expense.
Oh,
So what
geez.
that now this maybe get a little bit in the weeds, but I'll keep it brief. Basically, when I am part of my salary in developing my product is developing software. So I'm developing software like advancement for my SaaS app. I'm developing software. So a portion of my salary is dedicated to doing that. Does that
Right.
make sense?
Yeah, yeah.
So normally that would be considered an expense in the current year, and I would not have to pay taxes with regard to that. So what that means is that portion of time, I cannot take that expense deduction this year. I have to take it out over 5 years now.
So they
So
amortize that now.
yes, so it's amortized. So
Yikes.
basically, I still paid all my withholding like I did that last year, but this year I have a bill that is almost twice the size of what I withheld last year.
Ouch.
That
So
sucks.
it's huge bill.
Oh man, oh man, oh man.
Now, long term, of course, we're talking 5.5 years. Everything will eventually smooth out because I'll keep accruing, portions of this. The amortization will build up to the same point it was before they made this wacky rule change. And I'll eventually get back to the way it was. But this year, it's
Oh,
painful the amount of money I got to come up with.
yikes.
Yeah. So anyway, that was fun. I'm it's been happening over the last couple of weeks, but that's the big one this week when I found out the exact amount from the accountant, and I'm like, oh, are you kidding me? But anyway.
It's funny how all the Americans I talk to this week every year, they just look so drained and pale and pissed off, and it's just it's so it's a brutal week.
Well, I mean, it would be fine, but with the changes, that's just what's
Well,
happening.
I mean, just even the fact of doing the taxes is always just a
Well,
big pain
true,
in the butt.
true,
So,
true.
um, oh,
Well, what about you? What's going on with
well,
you?
we had, I mean, I had a reasonably good week. We did have a fight in our production environment that we couldn't figure out. We were getting lots of
A
lag.
fight.
Well, a fight with the not like a literal fist fight, but we were fighting with some lag spikes, latency spikes, and we couldn't figure out where they were coming from. And it turns out that it was Redis keys building up, and they just something went out of control and started building Redis keys up. into the millions, and we were like, what the hell is going on? But it started, then it started slowing cache down because Redis got bogged, and Redis runs the cache, and so things just kind of spiraled from there. And it was a real mystery. It took us forever to figure out what was causing this, because it was one of those problems where, hey, it has this symptom, so we look through that leads to this, that leads to this, and then 50 steps down you finally say, oh, that's where it's coming from. you know those kind of problems are real brain drains. So I'm a little mentally exhausted this week, but um, lots of things done. Still plugging away on this RSwag project and trying to get that all put together, and get
Mm-hmm.
an environment up where I can actually deliver it and let customers go in and use it. So I'm working with Infra now to try to get environments set up for that. But that's my big fun. How about you, David?
Yeah, just on your infra, do you guys does your ops help you, or do you use infrastructure as code and provision it yourselves?
No, they help us. I have a team that I talk to that helps on the infra side. Uh-oh, did we lose David?
Oh, he's frozen.
He's
Oh, no.
frozen. So anyway,
Guys, hear
hopefully,
me?
Oh, there you
yep,
are.
there you are.
You're back.
Had a
Sorry,
little.
yeah, it may drop out here and there. We're actually visiting at friends, and the internet's not too hot. It's good. It should be good enough, but yeah. I was asking if you guys are using infrastructure as code for the provisioning, or do you depend on the ops guys?
No, I actually have an infra team that I talk to, and I work closely with them on all kinds of projects, but they're helping me with this they do the provisioning parts of it, and then I figure out how to get things delivered to it and what needs to be delivered and that kind of stuff. But
Nice.
they actually, the leader of that infra group actually is a developer, so he knows both sides of it, which is good because that makes talking across easier.
Oh, very cool. Yeah, so my week's been interesting. I signed and accepted an offer. Moving on I'll be the last day at my current gig on the 24th, and starts on the 25th at the new place.
Nice.
We're 2 days there, and then we've got a long weekend again. We've got a long weekend this weekend, and then another long weekend. And yeah, it's going to be quite cool. I'm actually going in there to try and help them. They've had a situation where they've had a lot of contract devs over several years. So the cohesion within the team and the culture isn't really good. So part of my role is to actually go in and help with that as well as dev. So I'm pretty excited about that.
Cool.
Yeah, and they've been fighting. I think I was telling Chris earlier, been fighting a lot of depender bots the last few weeks, because our team owns about 16 odd services, and there's only 3 of us in the team at the moment. And yeah, it's we haven't really had a kind of business case to go and look after these things until they did an audit recently. And yeah, now you've got a business case, and now it's got to be done. And the interesting thing is, I've noticed the last few days, just as you finish them and you come back and you look again, there's like several more, and they seem to be. Vendorbots seem to be piling up a lot. There's a lot of releases coming out often these days, and I think it's going to continue happening just because of the state of the internet and security and vulnerabilities.
Yeah.
I think we're going to probably see more and more of this. So yeah. So
Yeah,
that's been my week.
I was fighting the Dependabot things too, and it was like, hey, you need to upgrade rack to this, so you upgrade rack to this, and then it comes to, hey, you need to upgrade rack to this because there's this new CVE, and then you need to. It's like, okay, why don't you just tell me to go all the way and be done with it instead of stepping me through this. Um, find all the CVEs through the whole path, please. But that's
What
just
I've been
not how
doing
it
in
works.
some cases is pulling, because our bolt system is it can cause queues. So if the guys across the tech teams and the other teams want to build something, and I'm trying to run a bunch of dependent bots, or anyone else in the other teams is approved them, merging them, and they're building again. What I do sometimes is I'll rather just, if I see there's like several, I'll pull the branch locally and just do bundle audit and just go through them. And there's a really cool tool called Turbo Commit, which is it's a GPT-driven commit message generator, which will
Nice.
actually, so you just got to add. So I do them incrementally. Like I'm doing this CVE, say for rack, and the next one is maybe for like a Giri, and then so you add each one, and then you just run turbo commit, and then it'll give you some messages, and you can choose, and then it just adds them, and you carry on to the next one. And that way you can actually merge them all into a build. There are other ways, but sometimes what I found is like one of the in a sequence of dependent bots, there might be one or two that have failed. Or for some reason there's real merge conflicts or something. So then I'll just go the manual route. But yeah, there are ways, strategies.
Yeah. So Rebuilt asks, hey, how you doing, Rebuilt? Is it bad practice to just update to the latest? No, it's not bad practice, but it can be a dangerous practice sometimes, especially when you've got very large code bases or distributed code bases in production environments. If you just update to the latest, whatever gem it is, you may break all kinds of stuff. So we don't just update to the latest. We try to do the smallest incremental update we can to solve the problem, and then take on a project to update it more. So if CVEs come up, we just try to, let's just solve this CVE because we've got less chance of breaking something, and then let's look at what else we need to do to get it to the latest version. So
yeah, I sometimes have to do something similar, like if I'm doing a client's Rails upgrades and I'm having to go to 6 and 6.1 and then 7. It's like, all right, I'm on 6. I need to update it. And I look at when 6 was released and when 6.1 came out, and I look for the major gem version around that area. So like I go in the gem history and I say, all right, I'm gonna update to like 3.2 or whatever it is. Just to try, because if you upgrade to the absolutely latest, it may have features that will break on Rails 7. Well, maybe not Rails 7, but it will break on Rails 6.1 or Rails 6 or something like that. So yeah.
like for instance, here's a for instance that just came up yesterday internally. Skunk isn't built, the latest version of Skunk that's released doesn't support 3.2, Ruby 3.2. And we were looking to upgrade to Ruby 3.2, but we stopped because when we did that, Skunk broke. And I use Skunk a lot internally. So, you know, you have to kind of step into it, and yeah, you want to go as far as you can and stay as updated as you can, but there's, you know, we're going to be talking about safety nets. This is kind of one of them. Don't go too far too fast, or you'll blow yourself up and then not have a clue what happened. So, is this a code
Baby
skunk
step.
then? Yeah. Go ahead, David.
I just want to give a shout out to Marco. We actually old colleagues. We were at Record
Ah,
Shop together.
nice.
Yeah.
Yeah,
But he's
Marco
back
comes
into the.
around to. I've actually modded him on our channel because he's just about at every show and my live
Yeah.
coding. He comes and hangs out a lot.
Yeah.
Lots of fun.
He's a good guy.
Yep.
Yeah. Great guy. Yeah, I think you actually hit the nail on the head there. That whole thing around, and this is one of the things around our discussion. Just talk about safety nets, and I think the premise of it is about, obviously for me is, I think just I'll paint a bit of a picture, but I've worked in different scenarios. I've worked in companies which have had a complete microservice based C++, Go, Java. I wasn't working in those languages. I was writing a lot of Rails scripts to deploy these microservices to Windows servers, believe it or not. 54 odd services. And
Did you say
there
54?
54 services on Windows.
Yikes.
Yeah.
Holy moly. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, these are the kind of guys, genius guys. I mean, they wrote back then. They had a machine learning solution which would they put on the front of trucks and drive down the road, and they could actually pick up what are known as crocodile cracks. They artifacts in the road, which will determine that potholes would eventually come about. So they then use it for preventative maintenance. So you track these things, you pop them on a GIS, on a map using GIS system, and a report is sent out, and the maintenance guys know where to go and go fix these things. So the guys the idea was to put the cameras on the garbage removal trucks, because they do all the routes, right? So you're actually getting all the data you need. Yeah, so I worked in that scenario. Then I worked in an agency where we built apps for people. Come in with their idea, and we'd actually bootstrap the whole project. In some cases, we would have long-term ownership of it for them and maintain it. Other cases, they would take it off and go start up their own dev teams. We also did things like audits, where clients would come to us and say, look, I want to perhaps say buy this company. Can you guys give us a breakdown of this code base? Or sometimes not even just a code base, but of the dev team. So you do kind of like a holistic audit of the health and how they do things. And so you look at the complete software development lifecycle, and you look at how they do DevOps and how their pipelines work and all that sort of thing. And yeah, then I've worked in crazy startups like with Marco, with the CEO there was Obi Fernandez, who wrote the Rails Way. And I've now, the last year, been working in a company in the fintech sector. Great company, amazing people. We do a great product, which we offer loans to students who want to study at an overseas university. So if you're from India and you can't get a loan from a bank there to study at Oxford or one of the schools that we do support, then you go online and you'll be able to apply for this thing fully online without going to any office. So it's a great product. That actual app started out as a monolith, and was eventually at some point, because, and this is what I've heard, I'm not 100% sure, but because of the difficulty the teams were all having sharing the same code base, it was split into services, Rails services. They call them microservices, but by no means are they microservices, right? They're little services. Oftentimes they're full Rails MVCs. In some cases, there might be a backend or just an API that does some stuff. Yeah, and there's a lot of them, quite a lot. So I've been able to get a glimpse of just how these different scenarios and how things can be done in good ways and things can be done in not so good ways. You want to get to a point where you've seen things, you've learned, and you look back and you say, okay, cool, I made a lot of mistakes, and I'll admit that. I think I've done code. I've actually got one project I did freelance some time back, and not too long ago I went and looked at some of the code again. I had to make some changes, and I was quite shocked at some of the things. And some of the things I thought, like, wow, okay, that's quite cool. I'm proud of that. But that's a part of growing, right? It's our ability to go and say, but yes, I'm getting better at this. Yes, I'm writing cleaner, readable, and extendable code. I think that's the key thing that we're after at the end of the day. And so I think getting back to what we were talking about, just the incremental updates and that, everything is about, I think, is a sense of a need for safety. And if you're doing updates, definitely you want to make sure, especially if you're dealing with dependent bots and you're dealing with anything that needs to be addressed, because it's not part of, like, you're not sitting down and you're working on a feature or project where you're saying, okay, I'm going to be upgrading Ruby, and I'm going to make sure that all the gems and all the tests and everything are intact, and I'm ensured there's enough coverage. That's different. If you're dealing with dependent bots, you want to go like very small steps. That I totally agree. And I think some people actually miss the fact that there are things like bundler conservative. There's the conservative flag, which helps you to also take smaller steps on the gems that it's going to update when you run bundle updates. So that's good to note as well. And bundler has some features built in for that. So that's a valid point there, Chris, in terms of taking smaller steps. Yeah.
Well, and you bring up kind of a good point. It's something that that I try to push on junior, not push, that's not the right, but I try to impart to juniors. It's really important to think about, as morbid as this is, the hit by the bus scenario, right? If I'm doing a bunch of code and then I get hit by a bus, can somebody else come in and keep moving my code forward? If my code depends on a lot of institutional knowledge to understand, it's not good code. And so you need to develop habits and practices to make sure that what you're writing conforms to the standard that's been set, and there's reasons that there are standards set, but also that it's readable, it's maintainable, not only for hit by the bus, but for me 6 months from now, right? If I have to go back and
Trying to
touch code,
remember what you
right?
did.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's good for you, but it's also good for the company you're working for, right? So, one of the things I try to impart is always think about, am I going to be able to figure this out in 6 months? And more importantly, can another dev come in here and figure this out without a lot of institutional knowledge? So, what kind of things have you seen put in place um, that kind of help mitigate that kind of thing?
I think the first thing, just before I do address that, I think one thing I want to just add on to what you were saying. One thing I've noticed is that there is there are scenarios where code is readable and code makes sense and the tests can explain what it does, but there are definitely scenarios where domain knowledge is required. It doesn't matter what or how long those method names are or how descriptive they are. It's just, if you don't know, you don't know. Nothing's going to make sense to you. And to that end, I've really started, and I've been encouraging guys as well to the whole thing about comments, and we don't put comments in our code because that means our code isn't good enough. But there's a difference between commenting on the code, what the code is about, and commenting to describe what it does. Describing what it does is what the code should be doing and the specs should be doing. But if you comment in the code, in context, in places, but within reason, it shouldn't have, massive code block, comment blocks and stuff. Otherwise, move it out into I like to use docs, a docs folder in the Rails directory. And within that, I'll put the READMEs and linked to that from the actual main README of the project, just explaining stuff. But I think, yeah, so getting back to it in terms of guardrails, and these are the things that I wish I'd known a long time ago, and the things that I think could benefit more teams. And it all starts with the most basic of things. If you're going to do anything, even if you're doing a little pet project or writing a script, make a habit of using, and this is more so aimed at juniors or people coming from any other language to Ruby and Rails. Make use of linters, of Rubocop or standard RB, and things like Reek, because they're going to pick up, they're going to show you things, right? They're going to, if you run it through that, it'll say like, it'll give you an offense. Okay, line too long in that. So I don't bother with those things, but the things like some of those things are pointed out. I remember the other day I was actually in a project. I was surprised that I think it was Rubocop pointed out that the code could benefit from a delegate, and I thought, but wow, so I didn't realize it actually do that. And because I've been using standard for the last couple of years. But those are the things, and I think what's important to get in this is these tools are going to become more and more prominent, more so with the advent of some of the tooling that's coming driven by GPT or natural language processors, right?
Yeah.
Because I mean, if you look at Tab 9, you guys are you familiar with Tab 9? It's
Oh,
kind of
yeah.
like it's like a code
Copilot.
complete on steroids. It's not exactly like Copilot. The nicer thing about it is it has more context to your code base, more immediate, and they have a different approach to it. You just have to tab right there. You don't have to go and actually to another window. and copy some text or stuff in there, or ask it to give you some options for the code you've selected and highlighted. They're both great tools. Tab 9 is just different. But Tab 9 have had some seminars the last while where they've been talking about their roadmap and just where they're going with their products. And part of that is actually things like auto documentation creation, helping with reviews, security checks, and all that sort of thing. So, and I don't think they're going to be the only ones. This is where it's going to go. And I think coming back to where we're talking about what could we do to be better at this and have these safety nets. And I think safety nets start with each of us individually. In that you should, if you're going to find yourself writing a lot of like Ruby apps or scripts, or you doing Rails apps, either create your own, scaffolded app that you can clone and use again, or using GitHub's templates feature, and put all the gems in there that you need, that you can get started quickly, that it doesn't, because that's the thing, that's where the problem comes in. I've got this idea, I'm busy with something, but the problem is now I've got to go and stop my creativity, or my path of thinking that I'm on. I don't want to interrupt that. So you start down this road, and the thing is, the next thing you know, you haven't done it, you haven't put things in place, and you've got a bunch of issues that are going wrong. And I've seen this, there's nothing worse than having to come across a repo that has had no linting, everything's different styling, and you want to run Rubocop or RB on it. But what happens is you lose all those commits that were previously made, especially if it's a team. So these are things, and it's almost like it's a pity they're not there. Like, even if Rails had a kind of a default and decided to go with Rubocop or standard RB, I mean, I'm so over those, like arguing which one or which way. I'm a double quote person, but even if it's single quote, as long as it's there, that's the point I'm at. It's about
be consistent.
Well, exactly, right. You want the code base to be consistent, and you want to also, the other side of this is, there's nothing worse than getting a PR to look at, and there's a bunch of issues in the PR which have got nothing to do with the actual task at hand, like implementing a feature. There's problems with like these new lines, or single quotes or double quotes there, or other things, reeks that could have been picked up by reek, code smells, and oh, by the way, there's a ChatGTP plugin for GitHub which actually comments on your PRs.
Nice.
Don't try.
It's
because
not good.
every diff you push, it makes a whole list of new things.
Oh God.
But it's interesting. Yeah, I'm busy with that on a little utility that I'm busy with, but I'll give some feedback once I've tried it more with the actual Ruby code. But I think the thing is that there's a sense for me that when you start with these smaller things, right? When you discipline yourself to say, okay, cool. If I open a Rails app, and that's one of the cool things. I mean, people are always surprised when they come from other languages or frameworks, and they see that cool. Everything's got its place and it's neat, and you've got generators, and even if you scaffold, right? You scaffold a post block, and you've got all these things. Now, if you had Rubocop RSpec installed, and you've disabled the tests, mini test, it's going to generate the RSpec test as well. So it does all these things, and they're in place. They're not conclusive, but it's a good starting point.
Right.
And if you've got your standard RB, and you've got Reek in place, and you've got Bundler, and maybe Brakeman, and you've got something like Overcommit, which those who don't know what Overcommit is, it's a pre-commit hook. So every time you're going to commit some code, it'll run. And if any of those things pass, so if you have something in your code that doesn't, it's an offense for the linter, or if there's a gem that's got a CVE, in other words, security vulnerability, and it should be updated. If there's some sort of code smell, like you've got cyclomatic complexity, or you've got methods with too many lines of code, or something like that, the Reek will complain, but one of those will complain. And you sort those out, and then you commit your code and you push it. what happens with this is it adds on to the whole thing of having your code that's covered. And when we talk about code that's covered, it's in other words, you've written specs for that code.
Mm-hmm.
And if that code has specs and it has good checks in place, your level of confidence as a developer escalates immensely.
Oh yeah.
I cannot emphasize that enough. It's like it's and because oftentimes is if you're starting out with the stuff where you're coming to Rails and Ruby, those are the things I found. Guys are like they're uncertain, they're unsure of the thing they put in place. They just like, and they're frightened to put out a PR.
Mm-hmm.
And the cool thing is then what I love about if those things are in place, you can then go and focus on things like giving suggestions to other ways to doing it, right?
Right.
And that's another topic. You know, how do you review a PR?
Right.
And always be the main. What's it? Be the senior that you wished you had when you were a junior.
Right.
And it's simple as that. Yeah. So I think it's quite a mouthful. There are some other ideas I have, but yeah, I don't know if anybody's got any questions around this.
Rebuilt has a question. Does Tab 9 do semantic parsing of your code, or is it a language model like Copilot and ChatGPT? I don't know I don't know Tab 9 that well. So David, that you field that one.
I think it actually does. It actually does a bit of both, right? So it'll know like if you have, say, obviously variables or methods or classes somewhere else, and it's going to leverage off that. But it'll also, if you can give it a comment and you can say, give me a HTTP net API to post to something. It'll also complete that. So it's got a bit of both, yeah.
So one of the things that you had talked about earlier was using these things to help learn. And that's one of the things that I've found that really helped me learn when I was learning Rails and Ruby and new languages and stuff. And also that has helped juniors that I've been talking to is things like, run the linters, run Breakman, run the I like Ruby Critic, but because it packages up Reek and all that stuff. But that stuff will show you where you can make your code better and what kind of community standards there are, and it helps you learn that stuff. Especially, Breakman, learning around security and what things you should look out for is really important. And with Ruby Critic, it does a really good job of pointing out, hey, this is a common code smell, and here's how you would probably solve it, right? So those things I think are really important. And then linters are good, formatting linters are good just to teach you good good habits for fitting in with your team and how they've decided they want their code to look. Because you may think, well, how the code looks isn't important. If I've got double quotes or single quotes, who cares? Well, it makes a difference when people are trying to review PRs, right? If you're used to seeing code a certain way and then you get a PR that's completely different format, it's much harder to parse, right? So, that stuff makes a difference.
It does, right? It does. Yeah, I was when I started out, and I was still a junior and working with all these polyglots who were doing all these microservices and a lot of Ruby scripting. And I was the one who like said to the guys, we should consider having something like Rubocop. And that was when I realized that no two devs are the same. Some are single quotas, others are double quotas. And I mean, the amounts of pushback I got from the seniors to come in and this junior come and change things up, it was quite intense. Fortunately, I'm a persistent bugger, so we eventually got a win. But the other thing was like for example, I'll never forget, and if I only knew what I know now, but so I wanted us to, use modules, put the stuff in modules, and also use classes, where it made sense. And they were like, but these are scripts, they're not object-orientated code. And, it was all these things. And I didn't know how to answer these guys. And I was like, this is crazy, man. What am I doing here? And it is scary. But the big thing, takeaway from those days is I never had anybody sitting with me and really actually scrutinizing the quality of the code, or hey, but you know that what you're doing there could actually be slow. We may want this to be faster, that sort of thing. It was all just, okay, cool, that does what we expect it to do, check. And Rubocop played a big role in helping me to get better into understanding these things. And obviously the community and reading books and getting out there and looking at stuff. And so for me, and now this is one of the questions that I have, is how do we make this simpler because you come along, you're a junior, or even coming from another language, and you want to just get started with this stuff. And
Oh no, he locked again.
About that one, but there's several of these things out there, and I think having a bit of each actually goes a long way to giving a solution that's going to be helpful to people, because you can sit in your own time, write code, get feedback, and actually learn from that. Mm-hmm. And in some cases, there's only about Greek I don't like so much, but it's like you go and click on that link and it takes you, and some of those things aren't very descriptive or very, I want to say, junior friendly in some cases. They do seem to be quite advanced. I think it's more the technical way of it, how it's been written. But I think these things would be great if we have these solutions, or maybe we've just got to blog more, we got to show and tell more, but encourage people to start doing this sort of thing, using these tools.
Yeah, and I think those tools are really good for juniors, because when you're coming in and trying to learn a language or a new framework or something like, there's a lot that you have to learn. And like we talked about in the pre-chat, I don't know what I don't know, right? But these tools like Brakeman and Ruby Critic and all those kind of tools will give you that feedback, and you can start to see patterns in your coding and say, oh, I have this bad tendency to do this bad pattern all the time. I need to learn more about that anti-pattern and see, how can what should I pay attention to so I'm not popping this code smell constantly, right? I need to understand that code smell because I'm obviously doing something goofy here. And I didn't have to go and know that I needed to learn that. I've got the linter or the tools telling me, hey, you've got a bad habit going on here. Or, something like Brakeman that, gosh, I'm constantly forgetting about this. It's constantly throwing up this security danger to me. Maybe I ought to learn about that so I can stop doing it. And I need to understand that better. Right. Yeah. So I think those things are really good for juniors to kind of point them towards, well, here's something I need to learn. You got to get that feedback.
Yeah, I mean, they do play a pivotal role in the success of a product, of a team's workings and the products or projects they're working on, right? Because at the end of the day, I mean, if you think about it, so for me, the success of a team is measured on the ability to deliver on product requirements and within a timely manner. Yep. And I can say this, just because I've been in places where it's been pretty simple or worked on code bases, where it's quite standard. You go in, change some stuff and it works. But I've also been on projects where it's a nightmare. It's an absolute nightmare. Simple, even the simplest of changes. And I looked at specifically one code base, and the biggest thing I could see there was that there was never really anybody with, really seasoned Rails and Ruby devs on the project for long enough to establish the patterns, because people come in and they just tend to follow patterns, right? And then what happens is it kind of gets solidified, because then you go in and you put a change in, especially if you're a new joiner, it's like, oh, this is wrong, I need to do it this way. And then what happens is because it kind of throws a curveball in a way that whoever's PRing it knows and is familiar that even though it's bad, but they're familiar with that pattern, they'll object to that. So this project continues down this path of, really, really bad path, which is unfortunate. But these things happen, and I think with this topic and this tooling we're talking about, and I think it's important that the more mid and senior devs also start realizing, and team leads more so, that these things should be, and if they're not in the project, do yourself a favor and sit down and have a discussion and figure out your ways of working as a team. Figure out, how does this work? Especially guys, you get people have teams who have high churn on pull requests, right?
Yep.
Where PR is taking a while, and because the person is doing it, like we spoke about, going and having to go back and make changes. And I've done that. I've been there where guys have said, "Oh, but your indentation is wrong," or this kind of thing. So you need to establish the ways of working, which include that thing of pre-commit hooks and making sure that the PR is ready, that you've read over it and you're proud to present this PR. And that goes a long way, and it builds a lot of confidence. But also it takes time to sit and explain to the guys, like, okay, what does this do? What does Reek do? And how do I deal with this? And then sometimes, a bit of hand holding and all that. But I think for me, what it's a pity if that isn't included in a project. Just especially if the project is a success and it gets handed off. The generations that come after, they're the ones who are going to feel it if these things weren't dealt with. So yeah.
And I think it's important to kind of realize too that while these tools are great to have, like the safety rails to keep you from falling off the cliff, it should be that, hey, you should go and you should learn the patterns and you should learn the community standardized ways of doing things, but you should also learn when you should break from those patterns and do something a little bit different because the situation requires it. And I hear a lot of back and forth about, well, you should do things the Rails way, or no, you shouldn't do things the Rails way because it has this problem, or you should always do this kind of formatting, or no, you shouldn't do. And I think what it boils down to is you should learn these standards, but you should start gathering the experience to know, when should I abandon these standards because they don't fit this particular scenario and I need to do something else, instead of trying to shoehorn this scenario into these standards. So having safety nets is great, and I agree with you. People should have these tools in their projects. In fact, internally, and these aren't silver bullets, they take some work. Internally, we did a 4-hour team meeting on RuboCop just to go through all the rules and negotiate how we wanted our layout to be. Right? We spent 4 hours as a team just doing that. Because we wanted to get it right, and because it's important, right? And we wanted it, because we had some single quoters, we had some double quoters, we had some, 120 character liners, and
you had to have your time for the religious battle. So
yeah, exactly. But we had to, as a team, come together and say, okay, this is what we're going to agree on. I'll do the double quotes if you give me 200 characters per line, right? That kind of thing. So, it's not just, hey, throw RuboCop in there and everything's golden and you're going to be, the team's going to be great and hunky dory. You have to think about it. You have to do the work with the tools, and they're not just silver bullets. And even once you do all that work, it's not a 100% every time it's going to get it right. You'll get false positives. You'll miss some things that should be caught. I mean, these tools aren't perfect, and they aren't going to necessarily hold your hand, but they do a very good job of guiding you towards things you should look at and things that you should learn. That's where I think the benefit of those tools is for juniors, really.
But this is the thing, right? So now let's talk a bit about optics. I come in even as a mid or a senior from other languages, and I want to get into Rails. Now, the first thing that stands out is Rails is opinionated. Rails has these really cool things. It's got structures, got things in place, right? Now let's take something like service objects, the whole thing around that. Service objects are not service objects. Give you an example, I was a big fan of the interactor gem until I wasn't, until I ran into some problems with it. I thought, oh no, I can change it quickly and go in and realize that, yeah, it actually caused coupling. But the thing is, and DHH himself said that when it comes to styling as well, that you should be free to have that, be artistically free to write the code and style as you wanted. He doesn't get the whole thing around linters, is what he was saying. Back in, I don't know if he still feels that way, but that was a video clip I saw some time back. And this is part of what concerns me around the liberties, because most projects I've seen, and just hear me on this, and this is the controversial part that I'm going to talk about now. These are my opinions. I'm not saying we should do these, but what I've noticed is when you have a sense of that you give a bit of leeway in some things, it actually can do more harm than good. And I hear what you're saying, Wes. You can't, not everything's black and white. You can't always expect structure to be the same and the lintels to work in that. But it's like within the Rails community, there is no cohesion around these kind of things. And these are things that are simple. And if that's the case, it actually creates a this overhead on like, oh, this is something I've got to navigate now. So which one do I choose? Why isn't it simpler for me just to go in and do this? Because here's a framework that helps me to do a full MVC, like boom, start styling with Tailwind, using Hotwire can do reactive, views and that. But outside of that, it's a mess. I'm not saying it's a mess, but to me, it looks like it's a mess. These are the things that, for me, are not appealing and will cause friction with adoption, where we want people to kind of like, exercise and practice these things. And it doesn't bear well for the developer experience for new people to Rails. So there's that, right? And then there's the whole thing around, so we all grieve skinny controllers, fat models, right? And something I have picked up is surprisingly how few projects use concerns. It's pretty evident. People rather throw stuff into service objects or even in the app lib folder and call a job and then trigger a bunch of code there. And I think that Dave Copeland said, why are people doing service objects? They should be using jobs, And his book, by the way, is very good. If you haven't read it, that's Sustainable Rails. There's some good takeaways. It's not how I would go about building an app, but there's some really good takeaways there. And I think so like I said, these are my opinions and these are my concerns, that we have this lovely framework, this great ecosystem, amazing people, but this is one area where things are very like, it hasn't been settled. It's not settled, and it's probably never going to get settled. But how does one address that? How do you go to, okay, cool, let's create a standard scaffold thing for beginners, and then you put in like standard RB, and other people say, no, it's got to be this, or people shouldn't be learning that, they should be learning this, or no, they shouldn't be doing RSpec, it should be mini-test. But those are the things, right? So,
well, I think part of the answer and part of the problem there, like, I agree. I like the fact that Rails is opinionated, right? And that there is a Rails way. And I think people should learn the Rails way if they're going to work in Rails. Is that always the best way to do a particular project? Not necessarily, but don't start wandering outside that until you've got experience enough to know, right? But I think part of the problem with this lack of cohesion that you were talking about is I view development as half science and half art, right? artists don't like to be constrained, but they want to be creative and try new things and go off the rails. But if you're gonna be an artist for a profession, you have to learn the basics of art first. You have to learn about perspective and color theory and what brushes do, and all this different stuff. You need to learn that stuff. Then you can start experimenting and increasing your creativity. So I think part of it is, I always recommend to juniors, do it. If you're going to do a project in Rails, do it the way Rails does it, right? Scaffold their stuff, do it that way, learn that way. Then learn other ways to do things. But you also want to learn a bunch of different ways to do things so that you can engage the creative side of software development, because half of it is art. You're creating things, you're making new stuff. It's so I think it's important to get your brain thinking that way sometimes. Let me try something that hasn't been tried before, right? Because if you don't, nothing new ever happens.
No, that's crucial. That's crucial, right?
Yeah.
It's important for innovation.
But I think some of the things like David's saying is that he goes in and sometimes experiences, for lack of a better term, chaos.
Mm-hmm.
And that chaos comes from Rails maybe not going far enough with conventions. Like, for example,
Could be
like a discussion we've had, where do you put your business logic? Rails gives no guidance. So people put it here, there, everywhere. Maybe put it in concerns or in the models or in the controllers or in service objects or, their own classes. Or like, why not even comments? That would probably start with religious war. Excuse me, not comments, quotes, single quotes or double quotes. Why not have a standard and say, hey, the Rails standard is this, and this is why, for whatever the reason is.
right.
So I don't think like they could. I mean, I think they probably could release Rails 8 and just say, hey, these are some new conventions the community's going to start with. And I think that would minimize some of maybe the chaos, like David is talking. It would give more safety nets, but people could, like you're saying, veer and go another direction when that makes sense.
Good point. So Rebuilt says, as I understand the conversation, stylistic differences can be addressed with tools like formatters and linters, but when choosing a design pattern to implement, there are no tools to reach for. I think, David, I'll let you speak on this a little bit, but I think, yes, with stylistic differences, there are lots of tools, but there are also design pattern tools like Ruby Critic will help you learn design patterns. By pointing out, bad code smells and things like that. So there is some of that, but you're right. It's not as upfront as like stylistic tools are. You have to dig a little harder for those. But what do you think about that, David?
Yeah, I think. Okay, so here's the thing: it's about what's out in the world, and I'm going to give a good example of this. So I've been asking ChatGPT some stuff around, like for example, I told her the other day I want to do something, and I actually gave it a big fat controller, right? And I said, I want you to help me refactor this code. And it gave me some options to model and stuff. And then it started service objects. And what surprised me is that I've seen it a few times. It tends to be biased towards service objects because it has learned. It's based on learning, right? It's been taught by all the material that's out there. And obviously service objects are pretty popular out in the wild. And I don't think there's anything wrong with them. I think they're great. They can work. It's nice to have your thing isolated in a good old Ruby object, right? But I've been reading some of the blogs from, I think it's George Monruba, if I'm pronouncing it right. The guy's been writing some stuff from 37 Signals around how they structure the code at Basecamp.
Right.
And he, I still mean to actually watch that. There's he did a stream with Jason Sweat around where they're placing stuff, where to put stuff in your project, and that for me is where I want to go, because I felt the pains of service objects. I mean, service objects, your service object directory can become a mess, right? And you've now got the separation between the data, and you start setting up delegates between, the objects and the data, but the data it's talking to, it could have actually, some of that code could have been in the model. And, we live and learn, and I'm just questioning this all the time. And I believe I'm doing it wrong. I want to get it right. I want to get better and better at this.
Right.
So to what Kristen is saying, yes, I think it is about that. It's about doing things in the right way. And as you said, fundamentals first, right? And that's a key thing about using things like ChatGPT for any discipline, is if you're going to use these things and you don't know the fundamentals, you might be lucky the first few times, but it's not going to be sustainable.
Yeah.
That's it. That's what people don't understand. They think that this is going to help them to have a lazy, lucrative life, but I don't think so.
I have caught ChatGPT making some horrendous security mistakes.
No, exactly. Yeah, and it's going to be regurgitating everything that it knows, because it hasn't got anything new, right?
Yeah.
And that's the danger. So anyway, but I'm sure it's going to get better.
Sure.
But I think for me, it comes down to, if let's just say we chuck out things like service objects, and we're starting up a new Rails project, and we had to have that frank discussion. Okay, we want to set up a project that things are done the right way. So you actually, when you scaffold, you actually scaffold a concern with it, right? With some boilerplate code. Now, I've been of the opinion, and this is something that some people might find controversial, but I've been thinking that if for teams, if you're starting out a new project in a team, or if you join a team and you want to get things right, you need to maybe even go as far as to outline, and this is something I picked up from one of the devs I worked with at, I wasn't on his team at the agency some years back, but they had in their team, they had actual comment code placeholders. For example, in the model, this is where the relationships go. This is where the scopes go. This is where the callbacks go. This is where these go. There can be a problem with that, because sometimes you want to call back close to something, whatever. But they've had good success with that. They really have. And I mean, comments inside the controller to say, okay, controller should only have this and this logic. Comments inside the view. I mean, we know how many times, especially new people, will start, doing calls to the database from a view. And helpers, I actually have been quite surprised how many people do not use the Rails helpers for methods in the views. I've seen projects where they've gone to great lengths doing API calls. There's no data in the app, doing API calls, and then creating a class in the models of this data, and then it goes back to the controller, and then it goes to presenter, and then the presenter does some stuff, and then to the view. But now get this, and then what happens, someone else comes along and they do something where in the API, they call the class directly, and then it goes back to the controller, and API calls within the presenter. And it gets as bad as that. Every time you change a page, it's going to go and do all of the API calls again.
Oh my God.
So
there's a thing that does that.
Yeah, but these are some of the things I've seen, and I'm guilty of some things, probably as bad. I don't know at some point, but I'd love to see maybe that's what we need. Maybe Rails needs to have one of those flags which says, something not condescending, like beginner scaffold kind of thing, but something that gives you that verbose kind of like, okay, this is what a Rails app would look like. But even so, that's also tricky, because then you'd say like, okay, but then it should come with mini test, right? Whereas I prefer Oscar. So exactly. So, what does one do? What choices do you make? What's but these, and for me, the funny thing is, or the interesting thing is, when you're in a place where you have a sphere of influence and there's not a lot of senior or seasoned Rails devs, it's actually easy to implement that sort of thing, to make those suggestions maybe even do an RFC, take it to all the tech teams and say, okay, let's go this route. That's one thing. But if you're in a team with some headstrong guys who are seasoned at Rails, they're going to have their ways of doing it, and they've been doing it for a while. So it's difficult to implement it there. But at the end of the day, these safety nets aren't there always for us. They're for those who come after us.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's the key thing. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Oh man, we are out of time. We could spend probably another 4 hours talking about this stuff, because I know you're passionate about it. I am too. I like the tooling and keeping things maintainable. So, but I do thank you very much for joining us today, and it was a great conversation. I really enjoyed this.
Thanks for having me.
Oh yeah, and Creston, take us out, sir.
All right. So yes, David, thank you so much for coming and joining us on the show, and thank you everyone in the audience as well. If you want to find our episodes, you can go to the website rubberduckdevshow.com, where you can look at all our episodes, see the embedded YouTube links or the audio. You can also check out in your podcast providers as well. We also do tweeting, or at least Chris does tweeting at Ducky Dev Show. So you can do that as well. And if you want to get notifications of episodes about when they're prepared and ready for viewing after the fact, you can do that also on the website. Just put in your email and we'll send you an email with that. So that's it for this week. Next week we have Grant Wilcox, and we're talking about developer documentation. So that's next
everybody's
Thursday.
favorite subject.
Oh yes. So if you want to
Kristen,
next week, please go ahead and do that.
Show, guys.
Yes.
Oh yeah, thank you.
Thanks for what you guys do. It's awesome. Thank you.
All right. With that, happy coding.
Happy coding.